Hello. Today, the class will help us better understand the importance and the role of protected areas in the world and in Africa in particular. The publication to be read additionally is the annual report on the state of protected areas, called the Protected Planet Report, as you can see here, and the World Database on Protected Areas hosted on www.protectedplanet.net. First, let's talk about history. Nowadays, more than 15% of the planet is under some sort of formal protection. We call these territories protected areas. The protected areas are seen in green on this world map, and the marine areas are in blue. The first park formally recognized in the modern sense of the word was the Yellowstone in North America in 1872. Its designation comes from the American pioneers' ambition to preserve an exceptional landscape that colonization would no doubt have damaged. It is about preserving nature in its original state. But obviously forms of protection already existed, some more or less formally. For instance, natural sites that were considered sacred were pioneers in the preservation of nature. Even though it is hard to say when they first appeared, some of them have been known and recognized for hundreds or thousands of years. But in general, the protection of territories responded above all else to a targeted use, like for example, hunting reserves, which were created for a certain elite in the Middle Ages in Europe. The sudden increase in number of protected areas and the surface they cover is a really recent phenomenon. Their number went from a few dozen at the beginning of the 20th century to progressively more than 200,000 today, spread across the globe. The graph here depicts this evolution that is most exponential since the 50s, and that doesn't seem to decrease as the recent international commitments appeal to cover more surface. Changes in the future will lead towards more protected areas and more covered surfaces. So, the recent history of protected areas in Africa, and in particular French-speaking Africa, can be split up schematically into three periods. During the colonial period and until the end of the 50s, a lot of classified forests were created according to the model of state-owned forests in Europe. The goal of these forests was mainly the preservation of a resource, generally wood, but sometimes their goal included the preservation of the ecosystem as a whole. Nevertheless, a few forests would only be protected for their wood, for instance, to feed the railroad transport with coal. The reserves or hunting reserves, on the same principle, protected the game for growing the animals as trophies or for commercial purposes, like ivory, for instance. This is what lowered the number of a lot of African species. Of course, there are exceptions, like for example the National Reserve of Mount Nimba in Guinea. We can see here that its establishment dates back to 1944, and that it was fully protected from the beginning. The decolonization is followed, generally speaking, by a neutral period as far as creation and management of protected areas are concerned, simply because the young states had other priorities and few means to invest in this sector. We have to wait until the 80s, and especially the 90s, after the Rio Conference, for a new momentum to begin with the creation of new protected areas in countries which used to have none. For example, we can see here the Lope National Park in Gabon. Another example, in the 2000s, Guinea-Bissau, formerly established as Park Network and the agency managing it today, the IBAP. This recent period in time also showed the evolution of some territories from one status to another, including classified forests that were often classified for the preservation of a resource and sometimes became national parks directed towards tourism, like here in the Dibale Forest in Burkina Faso. Above all, in this period of time, the management of abandoned protected areas was addressed, at least in theory, and sponsors started supporting them again, and in some cases continue to do so today. So let's have a closer look at the history of a park, like the Noikolo Koba in Senegal, because it's representative enough of what happened, at least once again, in the French-speaking Africa. The Noikolo Koba was created in 1926 as a hunting reserve. It then evolved from a strict hunting reserve to a classified state-owned forest and, at least in 1954, to a national park. In 1969, after extensions, the Neokolo-Kaba reached its current surface area of 2,256,072 acres, and evictions led to the removal of a number of villages, such as Badi, Damandin, and Niangani. In 1981, thanks to its rich biodiversity, the Neokolo-Kaba became a World Heritage Site. In 2007, due to pressures from human activity, such as poaching, the expansion of agricultural lands, and livestock wandering, but also the threat of Sambangalo Dam project, the Neokolo-Kaba was listed as endangered. Today, the situation in Africa is quite contrasted for historical reasons. We saw it. For legal reasons, we'll see it, especially between French-speaking Africa and the English-speaking one, for cultural reasons too, sometimes for security or geographical reasons, and finally due to opportunism. The map here gives you the current protected areas coverage. The darker it is, the more protected areas there are. The more green spots there are, the more it is covered by protected areas. But there is no real reliable data, and the reality on the field can be very different. Generally speaking, let's remember that today there are more than 7,000 protected areas in Africa that represent more or less a 14% land coverage and almost a 4% sea coverage. In reality, it is probably even more, as the data comes from the World Database on Protected Areas, which is obviously incomplete. This coverage is not homogeneous, nor representative at a global level and at Africa's level. Some of the territories are unrepresented, like deserts or coastline areas that, even though they are very important for biodiversity, are often not protected simply because they are densely populated and harder to deal with. For instance, on the left, these maps show important areas for birds, whereas on the right, we have the protected areas for the same area, West Africa. Taking a closer look, we can see that a number of areas that are important and should be preserved, but are not. There is no overlapping of these two approaches, of these two maps. So, as I told you today, the data on protected areas is gathered in a world database whose acronym is WDPA, for World Database on Protected Areas. You will find this database on the website, www.protectedplanet.net. Take your time, read the information on protected areas that you know. I chose, for example, the page of Comoa Park in the Ivory Coast here. Go to the website, use the tool on a few parks to learn how to use it well. It will be real useful throughout this course. Unfortunately, you will see a lot of information is still incorrect. It's up to you to make it right. That's the end of the class. The next class will be about the role of the protected areas in the world, and especially in Africa. Have a great day.